Hello everybody, I'm George from Ireland, and here behind me in All Saints Church, Sutton Courtenay, Oxfordshire, is the last resting place of H Asquith, the penultimate Liberal Prime Minister. Um, the Earl of Oxford and Asquith, as he was towards the end of his life, was born in Yorkshire. I can't remember the year, 1852, if I got that right. His father was a businessman, and all the biodata is there. And it says Prime Minister of England. Well, that's wrong. As an Irish Unionist, I would know. Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. There is no Prime Minister of England. There never has been a Prime Minister of England. But all right, it's a widely known pars pro toto synecdoche. He went to City of London School. I suppose they must have borders in those days. Balliol College, Oxford. He was called to the bar. Thrived as a barrister. Entered Liberal politics in the 1890s. And then, so it came to the conflict in South Africa. Was someone who denounced in strong terms, thought the United Kingdom had aggressed Transvaal and the Oranje Vrystaat. It wasn't he was saying that the rights of the autochthonous people had been trampled upon. He was cared about the Dutch-speaking populace there, and that interning civilians was impermissible. Anyway, he's not as hardline as some, but he was nevertheless accused of being pro-Boer. So in 1905, A.J. Balfour's Conservative government resigned. Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman came in as Prime Minister, and Asquith was there in the cabinet. But to Bannerman, they held an election in 1906, a Liberal landslide, the last ever one. But Bannerman, he then had to stand down in the middle of 1908 because he was very ill, and he died in Downing Street not even a month later. The last Prime Minister to die in Downing Street, although Campbell Bannerman wasn't actually Prime Minister when he died, but H Asquith had been summoned to Buckingham Palace by that stage by Edward VII to kiss hands, and therefore became the First Lord of the Treasury. So he's only ever the second official Prime Minister in a sense, because it's only 1905 that the order of precedence mentioned a Prime Minister. Prime Minister in an informal position to that stage, and hadn't always been united with being First Lord of the Treasury. For instance, A.J. Balfour had been First Lord of the Treasury, but not Prime Minister for a time, because for a while it was his uncle, the Marquess of Salisbury, who was Prime Minister, even though Prime Minister didn't even officially exist. I know. What a curious creature it is, the British Constitution. So Asquith had typical liberal views. Free trade was important, keeping spending down, maintaining the peace that they could, but there were new liberals. I felt they had to be a bit more interventionist, rejected some of Gladstonian liberalism without going all the way to being complete collectivists. They were aware of the growing strength of the Labour Party. The Labour Representation Committee had started as a section of the Liberals, and there were, in these double-seater constituencies, sometimes there was a Lib-Lab deal. One Liberal candidate, one Labour candidate would stand against probably two Tories, so that at least one of the Liberals would be elected. But anyway, so he became Prime Minister in 1908, but it was the height of the Anglo-German naval race, which was a terrible challenge, because how they were going to build this better society, the beginnings of a welfare state, when they had to spend huge sums beefing up the Royal Naval, these castles of steel. So his People's Budget in 1909 had David Lloyd George, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, introduced that, and the Tory majority in the House of Peers blocked it. So election January 1910, and it still wasn't sorted out. Liberals lost most of their majority. So secret conferences at Buckingham Palace, George V trying to be a referee in this dirty game of politics, he said, trying to bang heads together, and they couldn't sort out a deal. And so finally the king had to say, well, if you don't pass it, the upper chamber, I will flood it with hundreds of liberal peers who will pass it, and then you don't want to be rubbing shoulders with these parvenus as you see them. It's the same gambit that William IV had used to pass the Great Reform Act in 1832. Well, it worked. The Unionist majority in the House had always balked. That would have been infra dignitate to have lots of liberal, mere bourgeois sort of people there in the household. So okay, we'll let it pass. Anyway, so there were free medical inspections for children, and there was unemployment benefit job centres. Well, they were then called labour exchanges, things like that. School milk, and people said, you mustn't make them nurslings of the state. then people will be irresponsible. They will lose their hardihood, their sense of self-reliance that Liberals are supposed to cherish. That was the Tory response. Because remember, the Conservatives had absorbed some of the Liberals, the Liberal Unionists. 1912, the Liberal Unionists formally merged into the Conservative Party. But so Asquith, who was then Prime Minister when war was declared on the 4th of August 1914, and only a month earlier the cabinet said, if there is to be a European war, happily it's one in which we shall be no more than dictators. Because it was the 28th of July that Austria-Hungary bombarded Belgrade, and that was the beginning of the First World War. Precisely a month after Gavrilo Princip had shot dead the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his good wife, Countess Sophie Chotek, in Sarajevo. I must have been to the exact spot. Anyway, so Asquith declared war, and really that was liberalism out the window, as Thomas Hardy acidly composed the following aphorism: "Peace on earth, we sing it, and pay a million priests to bring it. After 2,000 years of mass, we've got as far as poison gas." That one was called Christmas 1915. So the idea that mankind was getting better, more humane, really seemed to be rubbish. So there was this advance to deadlock. The advantages was heavily weighted towards the defender, and the government took over huge swathes of national life. Defence of the Realms Act was passed. Spreading defeatism and despondency was a crime, so there went freedom of expression, civil liberty, habeas corpus suspended, the government nationalising lots of sections of industry. At least the suffragettes suspended their campaign because he hadn't been willing to grant the right to vote to women. But the war was really going nowhere. Casualties were mounting. What about conscription? The Conservatives have been calling for a compulsory military service even in peacetime beforehand, but that went against the liberal conscience. We don't do that. We're a free society. You can't win a war for liberty by depriving people of liberty. It seemed to be self-contradictory. But anyway, otherwise the war was unwinnable. And then some underage boys were volunteering, and they got to be whittled out of the ranks. And at least one Liberal MP said, all right, the logical thing is to actually have conscription of men rather than let underage boys somehow volunteer, lie and get in, and this often recruiting sergeants don't check too carefully if they're underage, or just know that they're underage and don't care because they're short of manpower. So the situation was going badly. There was no end in sight. The Germans refused to withdraw from Belgium. The British said, well, if you do that, okay, we can have peace. But remember, there's a doctrine of no separate peace, signed in September 1914, that the Entente, France, Russia, and the United Kingdom would make peace together, that one of them wouldn't leave the others in the lurch. The Second Reich was not amenable to the olive branch which was proffered. So there was a shells crisis. It turned out the Battle of the Somme, which is mainly, well, starts in July 1916, that many of the shells that were provided were duds, and there was a lot of hoo-ha about that. The Conservatives had agreed not to oppose the government, but even with the Liberal Party, this was thought to be a disgrace. His son Raymond was killed in action, and Asquith was increasingly known as Asquithy because he hit the bottle. It was a crutch for him. He was using alcohol to self-medicate against this grief. His very distinguished a highly educated son, a very accomplished young barrister, who thought that a glittering path beckoned in terms of cursus honorum, was going to rise to great things in politics, had been killed. Anyway, so in December 1916 there was a parliamentary coup d'etat. David Lloyd George, Liberal Chancellor of the Exchequer, who'd done so much to boost war production, he hatched a plot with the Conservatives, and they agreed to push Asquith out. And about a third of the Liberal Party joined Lloyd George. They withdrew support from Asquith. Asquith no longer commanded the majority in the House of Commons, and the Conservatives agreed to serve under Lloyd George, a Liberal Prime Minister. So December 1916, he stood down as Prime Minister. He was forced out, but he was still leader of the Liberal Party, led them up until 1926. So the Liberal Party unofficially split into Lloyd George Liberals and Asquith Liberals. It wasn't repaired till 1926 when Lloyd George took over as the official leader of the Liberal Party. But then there was the 1918 election, that 14th of December, just a month after the armistice, when a coupon was given by the Conservative leader, Bonner Law, and Lloyd George to say, yes, you're pro this government coalition, either as a Conservative or as a Liberal. So it's known as the coupon election by some, such as Asquith, who was saying it so contemptuously. Anyway, so that was disastrous for the Liberals because they've been the second largest party, and by 1922 they were so they've been the largest party. 22 they become well, 18 they become the second largest party, and by 22 they become the third largest party, and they've never got back into second position. They've never come close, really, in terms of seats to overtaking the Labour Party ever since. So he'd been Prime Minister at the time of the Easter Rising in Dublin, and said, well, we've got to execute these rebels, these pro-Germans. But then when it came to the conflict of 1919 to 21, he's part of the Peace with Ireland Council, saying that the United Kingdom ought to grant independence, or at least great autonomy, to the major portion of Ireland, and indeed that came to pass. So he retired from politics in 1926. He died in 1928. He had not been very successful in the end, I suppose. He achieved quite a lot as Prime Minister, but what really wrecked liberalism was the First World War, which wrecked so much. Increased national debt by 14 times. You'd think that if there's the Labour's to left and the Conservatives to right, the Liberals might dominate. In fact, the opposite was the case. The moderates didn't dominate. And they'd solve the issues like of Welsh disestablishment, or by restricting alcohol, they'd solve that issue, because temperance was a big matter in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Various alcohol restrictions introduced in the First World War, going dry on a Sunday, higher taxes on alcohol, 10 o'clock closing time as it was, and things like that. They'd solve poverty, but not enough to mean that you didn't need a Labour Party and things like that. And they weren't willing to be nationalistic enough as the Conservatives. So that is Astor. I'm not quite sure why he's buried here in the same cemetery as Orwell. And when I was walking towards this, what did I notice? Yeah, a torchbearer from the 1948 Olympics, a young Mr. Major, who died only 4 months later. I don't think he was related to John Major. He went into the Olympic Stadium at Wembley, carrying the British torch, and the guy carrying the flag had forgotten the flag or lost the flag. National disgrace in front of the whole world. Some quick-thinking chap had to smash the window of a car when he saw a Union flag and borrow it. And a police officer came to arrest him, and he explained, we were the only country in the world without a flag. So there was a flag. And this bloke was president of the Cambridge University Athletic Association. Here he is, a blonde man. The British Olympic Committee said it had to be a blonde man. George Henry Major, carrying the torch in front of the eyes of the whole world were on this man. And here he lies. Wow. I didn't know his name. I knew a bit about him already. But perhaps he'd been president of the Cambridge University Athletic Association quite a few years before, given that he was about 33 when he carried the Olympic torch in 1948. And then he died the 3rd of January the next year. I wonder why. Presumably he was a picture of health. Maybe a car crash or something. All right, that's enough from me here at Sutton Courtenay, All Saints Graveyard. Just a few miles south of Oxford. So please follow me on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter and so on, and donate to me most liberally, as in Asquith was a liberal. His great-granddaughter is that Bonham Carter, that actress Helena Bonham Carter. And did one of his relatives marry Jean Harlow? I'm not sure. No, they mocked Jean Harlow, because Asquith's first wife died. And he married again. His second wife was much younger than him. His grandson, Mark Bonham Carter, was always trying to be elected as a Liberal MP, but his efforts were never crowned with success. All right, toodaloo.